de Oro en la Bienal de Arquitectura de Venecia de 2012 por la exposición que curó con Urban Think Tank. Es curador en jefe del Museo de Diseño en Londres y jefe de curaduría y escritura en la Design Academy de Eindhoven. Ha sido director de Strekja Press, crítico de diseño en The Guardian y editor de la revista Icon. Autor del libro Ciudades Radicales, un viaje a la nueva arquitectura latinoamericana. Agradecemos el apoyo de British Council. Recibamos a Justin con un fuerte aplauso.
Hello. So, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm English, so of course I need to start with an apology. I'm sorry about my voice. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the flu hit me and it broke my voice. But I'm going to try and get through this. And I know you're probably starving too, so I'll do my best to get through my book in half an hour. So I wrote a book called Radical Cities, which is about Latin America, and it argues that Latin America has been an important testing ground for radical ideas in city making. You might ask, why Latin America? In fact, maybe another apology. Maybe I should start by saying that I feel very humble being here as an outsider, as an Englishman coming to tell you about Latin America. But there's a reason. There's a reason why Latin America has been such an important testing ground, and that's because Latin America experienced mass urbanization long before the flashpoints that we always talk about today, long before China, India, Africa. We're constantly being told that the world is now 50% urbanized. Well, in Latin America, most countries have about 80% urbanization. We're constantly being told how many millions of people need to move to cities every year in China and so on. Scary statistics. Well, in the mid-20th century, those scary statistics were coming out of Latin America. Out of cities like this one, Mexico City, which in 1940 had a population of 1 million people and is now around 22 million people. So the mid-20th century solution to mass urbanization was this. It's a place you know very well, Tlatelolco, 1964, designed by Mario Panni. And it is the Corbusian city taken to its logical conclusion. And by that I mean built on the scale of the New World. This is much bigger than anything, any social housing complex in Europe, much bigger than anything Corbu built himself. It's for 100,000 people. And that was how we handled mass urbanization in the mid-20th century, in 1964. And there are many qualities to this place, but it's safe to say that at a certain point, governments across Latin America realized that they couldn't build these things fast enough or cheap enough to keep up with the pace of urbanization. And more importantly, a new political and economic ideology spread south from America, neoliberalism, or what we now call neoliberalism, and persuaded these governments not to build things like this, not to spend the money, but actually to let the market take care of it. And to let social policies and let the economists and the sociologists deal with the problem of the city, not the architects. And we know now, with 40, 50 years hindsight, what the result of that policy was. And it looks like this. So this is Caracas, a city where 2 million people live in slums around the periphery of the city. And when I say that Latin America has become an important testing ground in new ideas of city making, it's partly because of that extreme inequality you see in this image. This is a social and psychological and physical divide between the informal and the formal city. It's an amazing photograph by Iwan Ban, by the way, I should point out. And so, of course, when the state retreats from the problem of mass urbanization and urban poverty, they pull the power away from architects, and the architect is more or less absent from this problem for 30 years. And the other reason why this image is important is because this zone that you see here is increasingly the majority urban condition across the global south, where we know most urbanization is happening in the global south. And we know, or the UN predicts, that by 2030, 2 billion people will be living in conditions like this. And what my book is about, and what Latin America has been good at pioneering, is how we bridge that divide. I'm going to give you a few brief episodes from the book. Some of them are quite well known. But the story of informal development as a strategy starts in the 1960s, I would argue. One of the first observers of this process was an English architect called John Turner, and he was working in Peru in the 1960s in Lima. And he observed, he was observing informal communities like this in Lima, the barriadas, and he made a very controversial conclusion. And it was that all of those modernist housing towers that the architects were building on the periphery of the city were not necessarily better for the populations than what they could build themselves. Why? Because, well, for a number of reasons. One, because normally they moved the poor to the edge of the city and gave them buildings which looked good but cost them a lot more in rent, in taxes. Most importantly, there's one thing you cannot do in a modernist apartment block, and that's expand. When your family grows, you can't add another story. You have to subdivide. And so you get very dense occupations of tower blocks. So Turner argued that housing is a verb. It's not what it looks like, it's what it does for you. And he had this notion of the empowering shack. In other words, it looks like a shack. It doesn't look like much, but it's empowering. And his ideas became the basis for an important housing competition called Previ in 1969 in Lima. And Previ was fascinating because it invited many of the greatest architects in the world to take part in a competition to develop a system of low-rise but high-density neighborhoods which people could expand over time. And when I say many of the greatest architects in the world, I'm talking about people like the Metabolists from Japan, James Sterling from the UK, Charles Correa from India, Aldo van Eyck from Holland, really dozens of these incredible architects, many from Latin America too, from Colombia and from Peru. And they had a competition, and instead of choosing one typology to roll out by the 1,000, they decided to build all of them and to create 500 houses. And what happened was that, it's interesting because Mr. Big earlier was telling us about how modernism was all about standardization, all about building towers that look the same all around the world, which is true to some degree. Previ was interesting because Previ was the first time where modernism starts to threaten to become something else, to mutate into something more adaptable, more flexible, because these were houses that people could expand themselves. Now, what happened was that the dictatorship of Peru which came in the middle of the competition, killed the project. And it was considered a failure because it was very expensive, and it was forgotten about. And then 30 years later, or even 40 years later, people started to discover it again, research it again. And what they found was that those original houses, which were all one-story houses, had grown and become unrecognizable, like this one. A Charles Correa house that has grown into a 3-story postmodern house. These are James Stirling houses, which also grew. And this is an Aldo van Eyck house, which is totally unrecognizable and has morphed into a kind of suburban, bourgeois, almost kind of McMansion. But it's an incredible thing. I mean, this is people staying in this community and investing in the future of their homes, investing in the future of their community, with gardens designed by Aldo van Eyck. There's a garden. And so Previ was in a way the great lost modernist project, or kind of on the verge of being a postmodernist project. And it's now quite well known, and it became the principle behind another very famous contemporary project, which you all know very well, I'm sure, and is in Chile. This one is the Quinta Monroy housing in Iquique, which is different. It's actually more radical in the sense that it's much more brutally reductive in a financial way. You don't build someone a house and let them expand that house as the family grows, because you haven't got enough money to build someone a house. You've only got enough money to build them what Alejandro Aravena calls half of a good house. So what you see here is a courtyard system where he's built several half good houses with voids between them that people expand over time. I think these pictures are probably very familiar to all of you at this point. So I won't dwell on this project too much, except to point out this kind of interesting duality where the streetscape alternates between the modernist kind of concrete slab and the idiosyncratic infill in between, which is totally unpredictable and just takes whatever form it takes. You know, and the interesting thing to me about this project, and Aravena has built actually probably nearly, well, certainly more than 1,000, possibly 1,500 units of this kind of housing now in Chile. The interesting thing is that it should be developed in Chile, a country with very low housing deficiencies. You know, one of the richest per capita, probably the richest per capita country in Latin America. And this system works very well in crisis situations in Chile, like this in Constitución, where the tsunami destroyed the city. And here it takes a different form, more like traditional houses, where again, half the house is filled in by the residents themselves. There's 3 things to say about this. One is, going back to Quinta Monroy, nobody asked Aravena to build that housing estate. He didn't enter a competition. Well, actually, he did hold a competition, but it was his idea. The government didn't ask him to do it. You know, he had to bother the government. He had to pester the government to let him try his idea. And that's why in the book I talk quite a lot about what I call the activist architect. And the activist architect is really only different from the traditional architect in one respect, if anything. It's that they have to initiate the projects themselves. They have to go into communities and find the resources themselves to make interventions happen. You know, they're not waiting for the phone to ring or for the competitions to come up. And so that's one important thing to say. The other thing is that I'm surprised that this typology hasn't spread more rapidly. given that we know, well, what I said earlier, that by 2030, 2 billion people will be living in slum conditions, and we know that we can't build modernist social housing blocks like Tlatelolco fast enough to meet that demand. So we know that we're going to need some self-construction to meet that demand. Why hasn't this typology spread faster? It turns out that in Chile it wasn't necessary. It was too radical. Because in the end, what Aravena ends up building is these very nice houses, which, you know, he thinks are very boring. It's not what he wanted to do. So the question is, where are we going to see this happen next? Where in Latin America? Where in Africa? It's already happening in South Africa, actually. I can maybe talk about this later. But this idea of participation, of housing as a participatory platform, is really crucial to what I'm talking about in this book when I talk about radical cities. Let's take a bigger example. Let's take Rio. When we talk about the radical in urbanism, we tend to think of modernist visions like Brasilia, you know, the airplane master plan. Or we think about Le Corbusier's sketch from the 1920s where he reimagines Rio as a great, you know, single wall of housing with a highway on top of it. An incredible vision. But actually, my argument is that the radical city is something else. It looks like this. This is Complexo de Alemão in Rio, one of the largest favela complexes. And the interesting thing is that John Turner never imagined the scale that informality would take in Latin America when he was arguing in the 1960s that actually informality is possibly the way forward. He never imagined that this would happen, I don't think. And whatever one thinks about the slums, or the favelas, or the comunas, or whatever we call them, one can say one thing about them, that they were tremendously successful devices at incorporating millions of people into the city and offering them the opportunities that the city has to offer. But we have to be careful. I mean, I'm not celebrating informality. I'm just stating a fact that it's only the informal city that has allowed the millions of people to come in to Latin American cities. And Rio is really an important touch point in this story because it marks a major urban U-turn, or a U-turn in urban policy, because it's the first city to really recognize the favela as a fact on the ground. As in, it's not something, all of this, oops, if I can go back. Everything you see here is not pre-urban. It's not waiting to be demolished so that we can build modernist tower blocks on top of it. It is a kind of city. And Rio recognizes that in the 1990s with a project called Favela Bairro, which is incredibly influential, but makes some very small gestures to try and upgrade the favela into a more recognizable form of urbanity, or what we think of as urbanity. And it does so with some very simple projects, but hundreds of them, in hundreds of favelas. Projects like these, where you take basically a landslide kind of site, and you landscape it with steps, or you build roads and bridges across this kind of semi-rural landscape, or you inject moments of traditional urbanity, like these public squares, to try and create, yes, social meeting spaces, but also to upgrade the appearance of the favela. Because part of the stigma of the favela is appearance. So they would build these things along the borders with middle-class communities so that to encourage more of a kind of interaction across that border that I showed you earlier. And in a way to inject what we think of in the West as kind of Western model of urbanity. And this became hugely influential and went on for 10 years, and they upgraded about 300 or 400 favelas. And then, but the one thing they didn't do was housing. So it was all about infrastructure, public space, sanitation, landscaping, and they hoped that people would upgrade their houses on their own. That didn't quite happen, and so in the 2000s, the mayor of Rio launched a new campaign. It was going to be called Morar Carioca, and they were going to concentrate on housing. And they were going to spend billions of dollars upgrading the rest of the favelas. And they said, by 2020, all the favelas will be upgraded. There'll be no more favelas, effectively. And what happened? Rio won the World Cup. Rio won the Olympics. They started to spend billions of dollars on stadiums, on other kinds of infrastructure. And what happened to Morar Carioca? It disappeared. It never happened. So this is a cautionary tale about the power of mega sporting events to change the city. People talk about social legacy. Actually, in Rio's case, I think we can't really talk about a social legacy. It's now a story of evictions, and if you have a lawyer, you might be lucky enough to save your house from the wrecking ball, and then you get to live like this. And the citizens of Rio are aware of what's going on. And 9 minutes, wow, okay. Let's move to Caracas. I showed you this image earlier. I mean, it's an extraordinary city, and a city where extraordinary things happen. Let me skip through quickly a few things that have happened. Like Tlatelolco, a standard story, 1950s social housing blocks, the superbloques, Via Nueva, and at the time this was the biggest social housing project in Latin America. What happens? It becomes the bones of an informal city. I would ordinarily talk about urban think tanks' work here. I'll just point out this cable car system to the barrio of San Agustin. That was a 1-hour journey by foot, and now it takes 10 minutes by cable car. Again, the cable car was initiated by urban think tank. So this idea of the activist architect is one where they're not just initiating, the architect is acting as a social connector, a connector between the community and municipal power. Now, this is important because I'm not celebrating informality. What's absolutely clear is that people can build their own homes and they can build their own communities at a scale we never imagined, but they cannot build themselves a piece of transport infrastructure. And for that, you do need the city or the state or the mayor. And what the architect is doing here is being a kind of connector, a social connector with the community to the valuable, top-down strategic vision and funding that it takes to build a piece of urban infrastructure. But I'm going to talk about a different phenomenon from Caracas, which is even more extreme, if you like, and it's Torre David, a project many of you probably aware of. Stuart Brand, the American counterculture impresario, once said that all buildings are predictions and all predictions are wrong. And this building was a failed prediction. It was meant to be a banking headquarters in the 1990s. It's a 45-story skyscraper. But the developer died and the economy crashed and the building was empty for 10 years. And so what happened one year after major flooding devastated the city was that people started to squat this building. And you can see here, they're squatting up to the 28th story. And this is a kind of vernacular treatment of the facade where they removed the postmodernist mirrored glass because there was no air conditioning inside, so they needed ventilation. And they built their own balconies. And here it is in the heart of the financial district of Caracas. I'm talking here about, I suppose, people power and demagoguery. Chavez encouraged people to occupy empty buildings because he didn't have a valid, he simply didn't have an alternative strategy for housing them at the time. And So 3,000 people occupied this building for several years, for about 5 years, or more actually, for about 7 years. And this would have been the gilded corporate atrium of the bank, of the banking headquarters. Instead, it's where the community held their community meetings. It's where they self-organized and, divided the building up into apartments for themselves. They brought in electricity, they brought in running water, and basically they took a kind of dead skeleton and they brought it to life. And, this is not really an architectural story in some ways. What it is a symbol. This is a symbol of finance capital that was turned into a symbol of social capital, because people took over this empty building and made a use for it, and they made homes in it. And you must know Le Corbusier's drawing of the Maison Domino from 1914, which is just 2 slabs of concrete, well, 3, connected by a staircase. This photograph, again, these are photographs by Iwan Ban. This photograph really reminds me of that drawing. And the Maison Domino was the first piece of open architecture. Architecture is an open system, where the building has to be completed by the residents themselves. And in this case, where Urban Think Tank and I were arguing that this was a 45-story open structure to be finished by the residents themselves. And here's someone's apartment. This is someone who took a risk and invested in the future of their life in this building. Actually, he made the wrong choice in the end, because everybody was evicted last year. But this is, again, it's his aspiration to a normal middle-class existence. It actually reminds me of that Lady Regina from the previous movie in the Barbican, the way she does her flat in this very old-fashioned way in a modernist tower block. This guy with his arches and his flying ducks. It's an aspiration to normality. And here's the gym on the 28th story. And again, not to romanticize, because this guy is pumping iron 2 feet away from a 28-story drop. It's a dangerous building, or it was. But it's a symbol of what people can do when they have to. And we were arguing that it's a kind of urban laboratory. What do you do when millions of people live in poverty around the circumference of the city and there are empty skyscrapers in the middle? What happens in cities like China, where they're building all of these tower blocks, and then the property bubble crashes, bursts, and you get left with dozens of empty buildings in the middle of the city? How do you reoccupy those? And the crucial thing about this building is that the skyscraper only exists because of the invention of the elevator. And people, there was no elevator in Torre David, so imagine walking up 28 stories every day. A brief note about politics. This is the mayor of Bogota from the 1990s, Antanas Mockus. And a separate point I want to make here, that it's possible to change the city without building anything. Because that was the situation Mockus found himself in the 1990s when he was elected mayor. He didn't have the money to build things like his successors did. And Bogota had terrible crime, terrible traffic, terrible degradation of public space, terrible traffic fatalities. And Mockus decided that if you can't change the city, by building things, you can change the way people behave. And he was really a kind of performance artist in many ways. This is him and his alter ego, super citizen, super ciudadano. And he did very unorthodox things. He fired the traffic police and replaced them with mime artists. This is most famously because the traffic police were corrupt, and people don't change their behavior when they're told to by a corrupt authority figure. He did other things. He distributed hundreds of thousands of red cards so that people could, like red cards like the football referees use, so that people could shame each other if they were driving badly or selfishly. Marcus said, if you can't change the hardware, change the software. So he had this idea that you could change the city without leaving any tangible legacy. And his successors, like Enrique Peñalosa, who's more famous, he built rapid bus transit systems, cycle lanes, pavements, all of these great things. He was changing the city in a physical way. But the radical Marcus was changing it in an intangible way, by changing the way people behave. And I'm going to, as I make a few final statements in my 15 seconds left, I'm going to take you to Medellin, because in a way Marcus set a process in motion that culminates in Medellin in the late 1990s. Because in the late 1990s, Medellin was the murder capital of the world, as many of you know, because of the warring drug cartels. And another mayor, he may even be in the room, I'm not sure, Sergio Fajardo, another professor, a mathematics professor, comes to power through a civic movement and starts to transform the city through through public spaces, beautiful public spaces like this one in the Botanical Gardens. But I'll just focus on one. And this is the interventions they made in Santo Domingo, one of the worst or most troubled barrios in Medellin. And it's a good case study because several things happen here at once. Now, Medellin becomes known for what we now call social urbanism. And social urbanism is actually not a new term. It was coined in the 1930s by Karl Brunner, an Austrian architect who was working in Bogota. And his argument was that the real city is, or the way you change the city is by working with what already exists. It's not like the modernist tabula rasa. You work with what's already there. And of course, that's what Rio was doing. That's what many of those cities I have shown were doing. And in Medellin, social urbanism becomes something else. It becomes a process where many different aspects start to work at different levels at the same time. Infrastructure, education, architecture, urbanism, civic participation, and funding from the business community, all of these things happening at the same time. So let me give you an example. They connected the informal city with this cable car system. I think it was the first cable car system connecting a slum, and it's certainly the most successful one so far. The ones in Rio are not very successful, but this one was successful. So successful that a university group in London did a survey of Santo Domingo and said, what would you rather give up, your mobile phone or your cable car? And the majority of citizens said they would rather give up their mobile phone than the cable car. So the next time you get invited to a Smart Cities conference, remember that statistic. So the first thing is you connect the city. Then you start to demonstrate that you're investing the crown jewels in the poorest parts of the city. This is the library park. It's a library. It's no coincidence that most of these these buildings they're building are educational buildings. This is the spearhead of an educational policy. And it's also no coincidence that it's an iconic building. In my book, I really don't talk about iconic architecture. It's really not the point. But here, it kind of is the point. You're trying to make the poorest parts of the city, thank you. You're trying to make the poorest parts of the city visible. You're making the informal parts of the city visible again, because for 20 years, no one was looking. They didn't want to know. No middle-class citizens would go to that part of town. My time is up. Ordinarily, I would take you to the end of the book, to here, to Tijuana, where Latin America meets the richest country in the world. And instead of just migrants crossing that border, you get the sense that actually the lessons of Latin American urbanism start to filter across and start to infect urbanism in San Diego and other places. But that's going to be a story for another time. I hope this just, in a way, whetted your appetite. The book is translated into Spanish, so do find it if you can. And thank you very much.
Agradecemos el apoyo de British Council. A continuación, haremos un break de 30 minutos y nos regresaremos en punto de las 3 para seguir con las conferencias. Ciudades Radicales, un viaje a la nueva arquitectura latinoamericana de Justin